Oh yeah, oh yeah. All right. Oh yeah. This is Johnny from the Iron Show, ironshow.com, and owner of the Fringe Radio Network. That's fringeradionetwork.com. Welcome to the Philosopher Rock Show, where two guys mine rock on a different strata. A different planet here, baby. In this session, we're going to be zooming in our kaleidoscope lens on the British progressive rock band Yes. Oh, yeah. Progressive rock, I would have to say, it's actually the proper name is Flash. A lot of people don't remember that, but since I was a Yes fan back in the 70s, that's what it was initially called. That style was called Flash. But anyway, yeah, Yes has been around for over 50 years. Well, since 1968, when their first album came out. Title of the album was Yes. Talk about an evolution. Yes has gone through the most severe evolution of any band probably that ever existed. So what we're going to be doing here in this session is we're going to discuss all things Yes, Yes history, Yes music, and Yes philosophy. I was first introduced to Yes in 1977. One of the neighbor kids said, "Hey, man, you want to go see the Yes concert?" I'm like, "Yeah, for sure. Let's go, man." And so I had heard Roundabout, and I liked that song. So I thought, hey, I'll try anything once. And I was just blown away. I mean, that was the Colors of the Rainbow tour, promoting probably the greatest album that ever recorded in the history of mankind, going for the one. And just to see John Anderson up there with that giant glass harp with the blue laser beams shooting out of it, and his flowing robes, you know, and his voice, his cosmic hippie voice. To the song, let my heart dreaming, past immortal as me, where can I be? Oh yeah. Yeah, I was blown away. That was, it was all over for me. I became a huge Yes fan and got all their music and followed pretty much through everything they had ever done from, you know, their beginning until now, which, I think the last Yes album just came out a couple years ago, and they're still together, actually. They're still doing shows. Chris Squire is not with us anymore, God rest his soul, but I actually talked to John Anderson in 1979 and had him recount the very earliest stories of Yes. And so that was a big deal for me. But without any further ado, let me take you to Brian and GK, your hosts on Philosopher Rock.
All right, well, here we are again on Philosopher Rock, and we're going to be talking about the fantastic progressive rock band Yes. I'm your host, GK, and on the line with me all the way from the US&A is my co-host, Brian. Welcome back to the show, Brian. How you going, man?
Doing pretty good, Garth. Thank you for that intro, and I'm coming to you this morning from on location in Lorain, Ohio, which is outside of Cleveland. So I'm up here by the Mistake by the Lake, they call it. And so I better say that quietly so my wife and mother-in-law don't hear that. But yeah, I'm up here for the holidays. Just got done with Thanksgiving, and so I'm just kind of hanging out for the holiday weekend. How's things going down under?
Yes, it's not too bad. We're actually in the middle of a heat wave here at the moment. Temperatures all up and down the place of around about I don't know, heading towards, well into the 90s, heading towards 100. So she's,
Wow.
and in some places it will be 100, and especially out west, she'll be over 100. Fahrenheit, I'm trying to convert Fahrenheit here in my mind because, of course, we talk about Celsius here. But yeah, no, it's very, very hot, and we could do with some rain. But other than that, it's all hunky-dory now. Brian, this band, yes, we got to kick off by letting our listeners know that this is going to probably be, I would say, this has got, we're at risk of having our most subjective show ever, because you and I are both big fans of Yes, and so we're just going to warn our listeners right now that, yeah, let's just call it. This is going to be so subjective, it's not going to be funny. So, do you reckon it's going to go that way, Brian?
Oh, absolutely. It was like pulling teeth to get these notes whittled down to something that was manageable, that we didn't have a whole 5-part episode on Yes. Just because of the fact that, aside from the music and the big fans that we are of their music, the personalities within the band, we could go on and probably an episode for each member. But we don't have time to do that. We have the interest, but we just don't have the time. I think we'd lose people if we did something like that.
Well, it's a good point to make about them. There's some big personalities in this band. There's some big music in this band. There's fair bit of controversy. And later on, towards the back end, we'll be touching on it as we go through, but towards the back end, we'll talk about philosophy and things like that. Although we will be talking about that as we go, because that's what we like to do. So you and I are big fans, Brian. My wife and I are also big fans. My wife and I share a interest in Yes together as well, which is fantastic if you can share a particular band with your spouse, because then, when that CD's on, you're both enjoying it. It's not a battle over, okay, now we can listen to my songs, because they're not my songs, these are our songs, so it's really good. And I've said this a fair bit, and I'll say it to anybody that will listen. My opinion of Yes, it's the one band that you can do anything to while you're listening. Okay, so you can work, you can drive, you can ride, you can run, you can relax, you can party, you can sleep, you can fly, you can do whatever you can think of and have Yes in the background, and it just makes it all, what's the word for it? It fits.
It's manageable. Okay.
Yeah, it fits. Like, there's some situations you can't, you can't be in, or you don't want to be in and be listening to, say, let's say, Johnny Rotten or Sex Pistols in the background, you go, oh my goodness, turn that off, right?
Right.
But with Yes, I've found that, you can do anything in the world that you can think of, and it can be happening. The only thing I might not do is I probably wouldn't go to church and have the headphones on and be listening to Yes. I probably wouldn't do that. Although it's possible, okay? You could do it, but
right.
It's probably not the right thing to do.
Right.
All right, so let me do a very, very short overview and a history of Yes. Let's just do a little tiny bit here. Brian's already said it. There's so much that we could talk about. We could just go on ad infinitum. It'd just go on, but I'll try not to. And bear in mind, I'm going to repeat, this is going to be very subjective, all right? But one of the problems that you have, and we've had this before with a lot of our other shows, when you're trying to fit a band like this into a couple of hours of a show, it's a band that's had a history spanning more than 50 years. It can be quite difficult to do, and it can be quite difficult to please everybody that's listening, especially if they're fans. So if you are a Yes aficionado, again, we've done this before with other shows, we're asking for some grace, as we cannot cover everything about them in what might be like a couple of hours here or more or whatever. So we're going to have to cherry pick here. And so we are going to cherry pick here as we move our ever so subjective lens over this most prolific band. So there you go. I wanted to say that. Yes is one of the most successful and influential and longest lasting progressive rock bands of all times. They were formed in London in 1968. They have more than 20 studio albums out. the first being released in 1969. They got more than a dozen live albums. They got dozens and dozens of compilation albums, and there's just so much more. It's so hard to keep up with the discography of these guys. I discovered something new just tonight when I was reviewing what we were going to talk about here. I thought, oh wow, I didn't even know that existed. So, there's always something new with Yes after 50-something years. Over the more than 50-year life of the band, they had around about 19 full-time members pass through the band. And of course, there were some other temporary stand-in and touring members, but I think it's about 19 full-time that have passed through. And one of the nice things about Yes, and I like this, and even though there has been some ups and downs and controversy amongst them, what I like is this, that with Yes is when any of them have worked on a solo project, and there have been multiple solo projects, other members often join them and help out, and the intermingled links between all of them is a study in itself, and we can't have time to go through that here, although we might mention some of them a bit later on just in passing. Now, it is really difficult within a reasonable period of time to give fair attention to all of the members, and we will be speaking a bit more about them later on. Brian will take in, we'll be addressing specifically some of them, but if I can just mention a few just to kick us off with. And because this is my show, and Brian's, but because it's my show, and I'm an old ex-bass player, I want to kick off with probably, arguably, the best bass player in the world, and founding member of Yes, that is the one and only Chris Squire. Now, sadly, Chris Squire passed away a few years ago, but in my humble opinion, Yes wouldn't quite sound like Yes if not for Chris Squire. He was the longest serving member of the band, having been there from the beginning until his death in 2015. Now, before you send any nasty emails to Brian, because Brian handles our complaints counter, don't you, Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's see.
Complaints.
File under T for trash.
No, I'll give the proper address. Complaints at Brian at Like Flint Radio. No, hang on. I don't know. Something like that. But anyway, before you do write and complain about what I've just said, I also need to mention lead singer John Anderson. And many would argue what I've just said, that Yes isn't really Yes without his distinctive voice. Now, I just recently read this article where there was an author of this post, and he'd written a really long post about that point, that Yes is not Yes without John Anderson, right? And he really did labour the point. And some people in the comments actually said, wow, you labour that point, But Yes not being Yes without John Anderson, well, okay, that's his opinion. I'm going to stick with mine, that I really believe that Squire's really important. And, you guys who love John Anderson are probably going, oh, no, shut up now, blah, blah, blah. So moving swiftly on. Yes also had a couple of great guitarists in their time. Now, there's more than these guys, but Steve Howe and Trevor Rabin. Now, I might start an argument here if I disclose my preference, right? Brian knows my preference about those two. What the heck? We said we're going to be subjective. Now, I really dig Steve Howe. Aficionados are going to go, how? But I really like Trevor Rabin's playing. I really love the way he attacks things. He's got a lot of aggression, and I like that. I do love his tones that he gets and all of those things. It's just that would be my choice. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about that. And they've also had some top-notch keyboard players. Tony Kaye, a very good keyboard player. The legendary Rick Wakeman, his son Oliver Wakeman, and even ex-Buggles and current keyboardist Jeff Downes, who along with another Yes member in their pre-Yes life had a huge hit in Australia with Video Killed the Radio Star as the Buggles. So I guess a lot of Yes fans will know that the Buggles, who's, Jeff Downes and...
Yeah, Trevor Horn.
Yeah, so Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff Downes and Trevor Horns were the new wave group, the Buggles, and they had a massive hit here in Australia with that Video Killed the Radio Star. It was number one for so long, it just sort of drove you nuts. It was just on the radio all the time. But here's a fun factoid for you. Downs has entered the Guinness Book of Records for performing with a record 28 keyboards on stage in a single performance. Isn't that something?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can't leave out the drummers of Yes. I really do feel for all the drummers in the world. You know, they often, not always, but are often left out when discussing rock bands. So, you know, people will talk about guitarists and lead singers and sometimes bass players, because we feel a little bit left out sometimes too. But drummers, you know, they just get left out. So, yes, they've had their share of great drummers. I'll just mention my favourite, and, you know, he's been there, you know, probably, I think it's the longest. Alan White, he done some amazing things in his time before, during and after Yes, but, you know, he played in the Plastic Ono Band. He also played on John Lennon's song Imagine. He also played for one of the best ever guitarists ever to walk this planet, Paul Kossoff, in his band Backstreet Crawler. And even more amazing than all of that to me was that he once did a stint in Ginger Baker's Air Force, and we all know why that's an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, with Yes, you know, they've done dozens of massive tours, like big bands like this. You know, sometimes the tours took 11 or 12 months or whatever around the world. Absolutely brilliant. They've also been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And just one more thing before I hand you over to Brian is, Yes is a odd or funny name for a band. I think it's a great name, but, you know, they got their name after rehearsing together for a while and they needed a name. So John Anderson, the lead singer, he suggested the name Life. Chris Squire, the bass player, he suggested World. And the original guitarist, Peter Banks, just said Yes. And so the name stuck. And that's how they got their name. Yes. Alrighty. So, that's a ever so brief intro to such a massive band with a big history. We'll talk more about that as we go along. This is GK, and you're listening to episode 8 of Philosopher Rock. And this is part 1 of our ever so subjective analysis of the music and philosophy of Yes. For more episodes, just go to our website, www.likeflintradio.com. That's www.likeflintradio.com. Now, if you'd like to email us, you can email us at philosopherrock@gmail.com. That's philosopherrock@gmail.com. All right, now let's get back to this episode of Philosopher Rock, where we say yes more often. But I'll just hand you over now to Brian so we can talk a little about the style or genre of Yes. Brian.
Okay, well, thanks for that intro, Garth. Kind of like you said, the history of the band itself and the members individually is so rich that we really can't delve into every aspect, and we can't explore every tangent, because if we did, it would take forever. And just those guys must have been and continue to be some of the most, busy musicians to ever walk the face of the earth as far as their output. Is just incredible. So as far as their style is concerned, for those who may not be familiar with the band themselves, or maybe they just, know about them a little bit or have kind of like a cursory experience with the band, Yes. I mean, I'd say broadly categorized, they're progressive rock, or sometimes called prog rock, or even symphonic rock, due to the sometimes heavy influence of classically based movements in the music. For instance, they incorporate excerpts of Brahms' Fourth Symphony in E minor, the third movement on the Fragile album. So that was like their third or fourth album, I think, Fragile. And, some of that classical influence that pops up in Yes has a lot to do with the keyboard players that they have on board at the time, assuming that a lot of pianists and keyboard players tend to be classically trained. The idea of the term progressive might ring bells for people, though, in the sense that it's a modern term that's thrown around in modern politics, and although the political term doesn't refer to music per se, necessarily, the two are linked in a way. And, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the most I want to say about it at the moment is not to point out the way in which they're linked, but rather the term itself is not only a bit of a misnomer, but a paradox at best, and a contradiction at worst. But progressive, the reason I say that is because progressive thought would require one to keep moving or evolving, not remaining stagnant or adhering to conventional mindsets, but a constant reforming, such as the postmodern movement that denies grand narratives in favor of a subjective type of truth, which refutes itself by being a grand narrative that denies a grand narrative. The way that this relates to the music of Yes is that this progressivism that comes through in some of their lyrics, it ties in with the progressive, the term progressive in the grander sense of like how I'm talking about it here in politics and things like that. But anyway, Yes was an example of an incorporation of jazz, rock, classical, like we just said in some cases, even world music, that was moving away from the blues-driven rock of the late 60s and early 70s. That shift in their style, coupled with the shift in the lyrical content and the themes, like away from the typical pop and the kind of, ooh, my baby, baby type stuff, relationship and broken hearts kind of like lyrics and music. It kind of solidified.
Can we catch that one again? Ooh, my baby, can we?
Like, let me do that in a little more passionate way. Ooh, my baby, baby.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, cool. Now I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. So they were kind of, they kind of got away from those type of lyrics. I mean, pretty much wholesale got away from it. I don't think there are too many. There may be songs that talk about relationships, but not in that sort of gooey type way. So their music's a little more heady, like it's a little more thinking man's type music. But these are the kinds of things that solidified them as the pioneers of progressive rock. Not only being, some of the first ones on the scene to make that move, but one of the more popular and, in my humble opinion, best bands to pioneer that style. So, I mean, Yes raised the bar as far as like musical virtuosity and aptitude was concerned by playing music that was challenging to execute. So they incorporated long passages and time signatures that required a skill that wasn't found in like your average radio rock, blues, or pop music. And I think that this quality of their music made them attractive to other musicians, hence why a lot of musicians are Yes fans, or a lot of Yes fans are musicians, I should say, backwards. Other way around. That kind of made them attractive to other musicians, who were able to appreciate the music for its technical acumen. So like you and I are both musicians, and so we kind of get what's going on in the music, where someone else might be a casual listener. Yes, they might enjoy the music, but they don't really have a sense for what's happening, the mechanics of the music. So there's the aspect of Yes. And other progressive rock bands tend to be musicians is what we use the term, or I often hear the term. They're musicians, appeal to musicians. I mean, we're going to bounce around through this episode touching on several of their songs or albums, but I think that's enough of an introduction, other than to say, I've heard this quote before, but I've never found it, so I'm not sure. Don't hold me to attributing this to Steve Howe, or one of the members of Yes, that when they set out, they intentionally decided they weren't going to do anything that was bluesy on the album, because blues was kind of the backbone of music at the time when they were launching. You had like Led Zeppelin, which was pretty much just repurposing blues, old blues songs. And Cream and just the big bands at the time were just sort of like amping up or hot rodding up the blues music that had already come up through America for sure, and was making inroads to England. But Yes, apparently consciously and intentionally said, we're not going to do blues. We don't want any we don't want to be a blues band, and we don't want our music to have any blues in it, really. Now, like I said, I can't vet that quote, or that's not really a quote, but I can't say for sure that was their intention. I've heard people say that before, that Yes themselves had said, they were sort of proud of the fact that they weren't a blues band, which is fine with me because, I mean, I don't want every band to be a blues band. It'd be pretty boring. But, so I think that's kind of enough of an overview of their style, kind of define and describe them. And I know we're going to be bouncing around a little bit, but let's start off with their album, entitled Going for the One, because I know, Garth, you've shared with me, I'm not sure what you're going to share here, but you've shared with me what an impact that album had on you. And it was one of their a little bit later albums. So why don't you tell us about Going for the One by Yes?
My life with Yes began with the 1977 album Going for the One. I had it on U-Butte cassette, and this album and two others really helped me get through. Now, the other two weren't Yes albums, but they helped me get through what was a very low period in my life. Before I touch on that, let's talk a little bit about the album itself, just briefly. This album features the skills of one of the more classic lineups of Yes, and that is John Anderson, Steve Howe, Chris Squire, Rick Wakeman, and Alan White, all of whom shared songwriting duties on this album. There's only 5 tunes on the whole album, with one of them, Awaken, running for almost 16 minutes. Brian, you've got to love prog rock, and I guess that's why I do, and I think you do too. Tunes from this one for special mention are the title track Going for the One and Parallels. Now, to some more subjectivity, when I was a young lad, I suffered a lot of what can only be called abuse of an extreme nature, and music used to help me cope with that. You might say music helps a lot of us get through some tough times. But for me, it was a little more than that. I used to hide inside the music. If you yourself ever experienced this, you'll understand exactly what I mean. When Going for the One was released, I was in a very bad place emotionally, and this album and 2 others, like I said earlier, not Yes albums, but there were 3 albums specifically at the time that I was listening to at this low point in my life. So for me, and I don't want to sound too negative about it, but it was a very tough time for me. And many of us remember particular songs or albums or music of some sort for the good times we were experiencing when we were listening to them. But for me, this was a very bad time. And Yes, and Going for the One helped me get through it. Music is very personal for me. And I know it is to others. I'm not on my own here. I'm not on my Pat Malone. It can help us get through some of the hard times that life dishes out. It can bring back memories of the good times and it can bring back memories of the not so good times. It is a very powerful medium, and there can be little doubt about that. Now, just before we move on, I'm going to hand you back to Brian here, but just before we move on, I want to share something else that's rather personal and very important to me. A number of years after I started listening to Yes, I had another situation in my life where I reached a very low point, even low on the one that I've just spoken about. And something that can only be called miraculous happened to me. God reached down from heaven to me and said, "Lean on me." Now, I'm speaking metaphorically here, but there did come a time when God touched my life and I learned to lean on him and not to hide away in music as much as I used to. So I just wanted to add that before we moved on. Okay, so enough about me and enough about Going for the One. So that's what this album, and remember I said at the beginning this was going to be very, very subjective. There's a bit of subjectivity for you about Yes's album Going for the One. Now, later on, I want to talk about a couple more of their albums. Maybe it won't be as subjective as that, but we might leave that there. Yeah, so I'll flick it over to you, Brian, and you can give us your personal overview of Yes.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that insight, because although I don't resonate with music the same way you do, which is interesting, but I think in some ways, a lot of times when you and I have discussions, I get the feeling that even though we both love music, you have a different connection with music than I do, and that's okay. That's good. But yeah, it's very interesting, like you said, that I'm sure there are people out there who can empathize with you. I mean, I can definitely empathize with you. Now, sympathizing, like I said, I don't have the same experience that you do, but yeah, music is a very powerful thing, and it's definitely has its healing effects, and can help us get through things in our life. For me, Yes was one of those bands that I probably had heard on the radio, but just they kind of course I wouldn't have heard them much, because they weren't top 40 exactly, here in America anyway, but at least not when I was, coming of age to the point that I was actually paying attention to what was on the radio. But so, around my teenage years, maybe I guess I was probably 15 or 16. I know I was in high school. I would walk home from high school, and there was a guy who I would stop at his he lived in a trailer, but a mobile home. But anyway, I would stop by at his house after school when we would walk home together. He played guitar, and I was, starting to play guitar. He was really super good. He was already only 16 or 17, but this kid was just a natural musician. But, so I'd stop by his house after school occasionally, and he'd show me some things. He was basically just giving me guitar lessons, we were just hanging out. And so because he was so good, and because, I kind of looked up to him, I listened to everything that he said, so it was just happened to be one day when, I was over there, he was on the phone with his girlfriend, and he was talking about going to see Yes. And like I said, I knew that they were a band. I didn't know much about them. Probably maybe would have only been able to tell you that I knew the song Roundabout, because that was probably the one that you'd hear on the radio here at the time. And this would have been, in the mid 80s. So anyway, I overheard him talking to his girlfriend about going to a Yes concert, and I heard him say that he had never really been into them because he was more of a heavy metal type guy, and that he had got an album of theirs and that he really was blown away. So, I mean, I can still remember him saying that, having that conversation, just because I was hanging on, every word that he was saying. So immediately I thought, well, hey, if this band's good enough for Kevin, and Kevin's pretty awesome guitar player, I'm going to go find this album. So I went to the secondhand record shop up the street and looked around, and I noticed that they had a copy of Fragile by Yes. So I was like, all right, I'll get this. So I bought it, took it home, and of course I knew the song Roundabout, which is the opening track. And then it goes into this big classical piece, and I'm like, what in the world is going on here? All these keyboards and classical, and I started to think okay, there's something good in this because Kevin likes it, right? So I listened to the rest of the whole first side, and the deeper I got into it, and I don't know whether I was wearing headphones at the time, but I'll tell you what, Yes is one of those bands that you need to listen to in headphones if you can. Would you agree with that, Garth? I mean, as far as...
Well, actually, you are better off taking your time and sitting and listening to them if you really want to get the full effect, but I'll still stand by what I said. I think it's one of they still, for me, are one of those bands you can listen to doing anything. So I particularly like listening to them while I'm driving. My wife and I have done several long distance trips, and Yes is always features, because they're very long songs, long albums, and they just help to fit the long distance trip for us. And I'm talking when you're on the road for a couple of days, maybe. But if you really, really want to hear them and you want to hear everything that's going on, I reckon, yes, headphones. I would have to agree.
Mm-hmm. So on the toward the end of the first side of Fragile, and when I say sides, I guess most people that are old enough remember what I mean by sides. But anyway, so coming to the end of the first side of the Fragile album, there's a part where it just goes into this, there's like a stereo pan that happens between the left and the right. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is really cool. This music takes you to another space, another place, you can kind of just melt into it and become part of the music. But anyway, so by the time I got to the end of the first side, and I had heard South Side of the Sky, and the riff that's underneath that, I was like, okay, these guys are awesome. They got some really cool riffs. This riff could be totally turned into a heavy metal song. And even though they're not a heavy metal band, I thought to myself, I could see where people in the heavy metal, hard rock community could be influenced by a band like Yes. So then you flip Fragile over, and then you get into Heart of the Sunrise, and it's just it's all go from there. I mean, it's just amazing long distance run around, and I'm sitting there listening to the time changes that's one of the things about progressive music is you get like intricate time changes and long passages of music, where there's a lot of virtuosity going on. It's just very intense music, but it's not intense in the way that heavy metal might ramp you up or
right. It's not
angsty.
Yes, it's not intrusive, right?
Right.
That's why I keep saying you can do whatever you want, and it's just great to have on in the background, or sticking the headphones on and listening to every minute piece. You know what I mean? It's just,
oh yeah,
there's just nothing you can't do. So I agree. Yeah.
So from that point, I was hooked on Yes, and I was trying to count and remember how many times I've seen Yes. Now, I don't know why it seems like I've seen them more than I have, but by my count, I've seen them 6 times. And that's since the Union tour in 1991. I went, that was the first time I saw Yes, which I'm very blessed to have seen, because that was the combination of, different configurations of the band all together at one, hence the name Union. And just as a side note, I was going to mention that in the mid 90s at some point, I was making a lot of trips to Chicago. At the time, we were going to Chicago for a lot of concerts. And one of the times we went up to the Metro in Chicago, I saw a band called Sky Cries Mary. And at the time I thought to myself, like, wow, this is a really kind of weird, different band, kind of almost performance art. Like there was a kind of like almost like visually there was almost like an early Genesis kind of thing going on. But I was kind of captivated by the band visually. And come to find out later, that was John Davison's band before he was with Yes. And so I actually got to see the singer who joined Yes later on. I saw him in his, one of his early bands. So that was just a side note. But, so yeah, I've, been a fan of Yes probably since about I was probably around 1987 was when I started getting into them. And, like I said, I've seen them about 6 times since then. And they're one of the bands that when they come to town, at least historically, I have, shelled out a decent chunk of money to get like good seats for. They're not one of the bands that I want to see. I'll be thankful to see them at all, but not one of the bands I want to see way in the back of the auditorium. I want to be right up front, watch the musicians perform and, get good. Plus I get all the autographed, swag that comes along with it. So yeah, we don't, skimp when it comes to Yes tickets. I say I mean me, my wife's not really a fan. I don't think she's ever gone with, no, she's never gone with me. So, of course we weren't married all that time either, but anyway, so maybe it's best that we start, moving on a little bit to, some objective facts about Yes. Maybe we could talk a little bit about Steve Howe, who's the guitar player. I figure I'll kick off with him because I'm a guitar player. So, yeah, Steve Howe, Yes, he was the guitar player who, well, we'll get to where he came in a little minute here. But anyway, so he's pretty much known for, he's the best, most well-known guitar player that was in Yes, I think, probably, more synonymous with Yes than, maybe some of the other guitar players, but he was known kind of for his signature sound, I'll call it. Basically came from him playing a Gibson ES 175D, which is a hollow body guitar, and it kind of gave him a tone that, at least up to that point in rock music, hadn't really been heard in rock music because it is a hollow body, which just gives it a more, I want to say like a more mellow sound. It's got a rounder, more like, I guess, yeah, more rounder, softer sound than, and he didn't really play with a lot of distortion on his guitar most of the time either. It was kind of half distorted, not so overdriven. And that really gave Yes a kind of unique sound and tone, especially when you consider, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this later, but especially when you consider that Chris Squire's bass was a little more overdriven than most of the basses. So there was almost like it was a little bit upside down in the typical sense where usually the guitar player, has the overdrive and the bass player has the clean tone. But they were maybe a little bit upside down in that respect. But Hal worked with a lot of bands after and during Yes, such as Asia, which people may know. I mean, I'm a huge Asia fan. GTR, which I'm a huge GTR fan, even though they don't really have much material. But and then he was in a band called Tomorrow, which was before Yes. And that band Tomorrow, some people might, if they're not familiar with the band Tomorrow, they're kind of like a psychedelic band, but they may be familiar with the song that Nazareth covered later on called My White Bicycle, which was a pretty cool tune, in my humble opinion. After his stint with Tomorrow, but before he joined Yes, and by the way, when he joined Yes, he was replacing Peter Banks, the guitarist Peter Banks, who had left Yes, to go on to some other progressive rock bands like Flash and Sin. But, Hal, before he had joined Yes and replaced Banks, he had auditioned for bands like Jethro Tull. Did you know that, Garth? Did you know he had auditioned for Tull?
I think I read that only. I wouldn't have known it before we started researching for this. So there you go. No, that's interesting.
Because I know you're a Tull fan.
Big Tull fan.
One of my favorite bands was Atomic. He had auditioned for Atomic Rooster, which was I could see like why he didn't fit in there, but I'm not sure what the reason, but other than the fact that the music style seems so different. But Atomic Rooster he tried out for. The Nice, which I know you're a fan of The Nice, and and apparently, like I said, none of these were a good fit. And again, I can see why they weren't a good fit for him, just based on what he did with Yes. I mean, Atomic Rooster, Jethro Tull, The Nice, these are all fairly departures from what Yes had going on. So Steve Howe has been very vocal or apparent with his veganism. So that's one of the aspects that we might touch on later, and when we get to talking about worldviews. So he eats a vegan or lives a vegan lifestyle. And so yeah, that's pretty much did you have anything you wanted to add as far as Steve Howe is concerned? Because I don't want to, like I said, like we've said at the outset of the show, we can't dig too deep into each person, otherwise we'll be here, an episode per person. But
I agree. But I just wanted to say, when you mentioned Asia, there was another Yes member in that band as well.
Yes, Jeff Downs.
Yeah, yeah, who's also from the Buggles. But anyway, no, that's let's move on.
Well, now that you mentioned that, now I got to say.
Oh, here we go.
That yeah, this is the part where we have to rein ourselves in.
Exactly. I know.
But yeah, no, because Carl Palmer from ELP was in Atomic Rooster. He was the drummer in the early stages of Atomic Rooster, and so Hal probably made his connection with Palmer, during the time he was auditioning for Atomic Rooster, and then later on, who shows up in Asia but Palmer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of these bands and these musicians were not only the members of, but basically everything that they were involved in was a super group by dint of the fact that they were all like just, heavy hitters in the music scene.
Good point.
Especially prog, progressive rock music. But so that's Steve Howe, and we, of course, we can't go without mentioning Chris Squire, which you touched on earlier. So let me just talk a little bit about who Chris Squire was. He was the bassist and vocalist, and I say vocalist intentionally here, but he played for Yes, and an important role not only in his, was not only his distinct bass tones, having played a Rickenbacker bass. I don't know exactly which model, maybe like a 4001, but he used a guitar pick. So they call him, do they say you're a plunker when you use a guitar pick? Using, playing the bass. But
now, didn't he not use a pick? He used a sixpence, didn't he? A sixpence, the coin. As far as I know, he used a sixpence, yeah.
I thought I had seen somewhere that they actually mentioned what kind of pick he used.
Okay. But I'm pretty sure somewhere there for a certain amount of time he used a sixpence, which is a coin, yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me, given the sound that he had there in the early stages. It did have a sort of metallic kind of sound to the attack of the pick on the string. But so the fact that he used, a plectrum of some sort, a pick or whatever, or a coin, it sort of shaped his sound in the sense that his approach to playing was a little bit more aggressive and out front as a bass player. Often when you're playing riffs that are similar to the guitar lead, the bass player normally puts down the bottom end rather than, playing on the higher register where the guitar usually fills that space. Squire had a more, almost like a lead bass type sound, and style. And that put him out front in the music. And that's one of the things about Yes, and we were talking about a minute ago, like, the musicians didn't compete with one another. It wasn't so that they played in a way that, they were all playing over top of each other. Somehow they managed to make this all work, with Squire playing, in a sort of atypical style. Same with Hal playing, a little differently than, with his tone and everything, playing a little differently than most guitar players would, especially at the time. So Squire had kind of like a lead role in the music rather than just kind of the follow along style of just, staying within his lane and playing, the low register on the bass all the time. But he was often, tracking right alongside with the, doubling Hal's guitar melodies and, just kind of playing like the melody lines versus like the, underlying tones. But, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Squire's vocals, because they were just as much of a part of Yes's signature sound. And you could really tell what he had contributed to Yes vocally when you listen to his solo album, which is called Fish Out of Water. He does the lead vocals on that album, and you can just hear who he was in Yes vocally when you listen to his solo album Fish Out of Water, which I highly recommend. And again, like you said, and toward the beginning of the show, that, a lot of the musicians from the band Yes backed him on the Fish Out of Water album, which it's cool because you still get the same alumni, but one guy is out front and he, is kind of taking center stage, which would have been Squire on that one. But, Squire also, was in some other bands and projects such as Squacket, which was a combination of, Squire and Hackett, which is Steve Hackett, who was a member of Genesis, as well as XYZ, which was a short-lived, attempt at a project. And the name XYZ comes from the meaning X, Yes, and Zeppelin. So it was X members of Yes and Led Zeppelin. And, that featured Jimmy Page on guitar, Chris Squire on bass, Dave Lawson from Greenslade was the keyboard player, and who else but Alan White on drums. And, it was good stuff. I've got a copy of it, but it was never released officially, I don't think. You can find it online, and I've got a copy of, I think there's like 4 or 5 songs, and, but it never like went full-fledged into an album or a project, and I'm not exactly sure why. I know like there are other members, other musicians who had dropped in and considered being a part of the band, like Robert Plant was one of them. But the one song on there, on the XYZ demos, is, got Squire singing on it. And, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know that one of the songs from the XYZ demo, the demo recordings, managed to be worked into a Yes song later on. I mean, it's not verbatim. It's not, they don't do it exactly the same way, but I believe it was one of Squire's pieces he took to Yes later on. you can really hear, how he just repurposed the riffs or whatever. So, I think that's probably be a good point for me to, we're not covering every member that's ever been in Yes, but just some of the key, players who, have shaped the sound. And,
so Brian, can I just jump in here and talk about, another Yes album? I want to talk about, Drama. Brian, do you like the album Drama?
Oh, I absolutely love the album Drama. It's sort of a standalone, but yeah, I love it, man. I love it. One of my favorites.
Right. Well, it is one of my favorite albums too. And, for Yes aficionados, again, I'm warning, saying, are they going to say, oh no, Drama, but I guess I tend to lean more towards of the Yes stuff that I like, the more, dare I say it, commercial sounding stuff. Although I do like most of their catalogue, but I find myself leaning towards this sort of stuff. So, Drama is their 10th album. It was released in 1980. Now the big news about this album was the departure of John Anderson, and Rick Wakeman, from the band, and the inclusion of the Buggles members. We've talked about the Buggles a couple of times. Trevor Horn on lead vocals and Jeff Downes on keys. According to White, so the drummer, Alan White, and this is after the departure of Anderson Wakeman, he said, and I quote, "There we were, Steve Howe, Chris Squire and myself. We were around London and I think we said, we'll book a rehearsal studio on Monday morning and whoever turns up is in Yes. The three of us," it's good, isn't it? I like it. The three of us turned up and that's where we came up with Drama. Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn were rehearsing in the room next door to us, so they were rehearsing as the Buggles, and it was just coincidence, really, and Trevor learned we were next door. Yes was one of his favourite bands, and he kept coming in and hanging out. Then he said, "I wrote a song for you guys." I don't know, we got to be kind of friendly. The next thing I knew, their equipment moved into our room, and that was Yes again. So that's how this Drama album come about, and that's how the Buggles ended up joining Yes. This album's definitely different to previous albums. There's a little bit less of the Anderson Cosmic type lyrics, a little bit less, a little bit less of that cosmic-y sort of stuff. I really find it hard to find a bad tune on this album. And it has to be said that despite the lineup changes, the album is definitely a Yes-sounding album for me, my opinion, and I know Yes purists at the time were very anxious to hear this album because they probably thought, how can Yes go on without Anderson? And like I say, I recently read a blog post where the author had said that Yes is not Yes without Anderson. Now, I understand that position, Brian. For instance, I personally believe that Thin Lizzy could never be Thin Lizzy without Phil Lynott. Okay? However, subjectively speaking, in this case, and don't forget, I am a Yes fan, in this case, it's still Yes, right? And we know that they end up using a couple of other vocalists anyway on later albums, and including the return of John Anderson, right? So let's just keep that in mind. Special mention tunes for me. It's the 10-minute Machine Messiah. It's well worth your time for a listen. It's got some really heavy riffs contained within it and some brilliant, as you said before, Brian, Rickenbacker sounds from Chris Squire. Another tune to consider is Run Through the Light. It's a great song, and unusually it has Chris Squire, who's perhaps the best bass player in the world. Have I said that a couple of times? It's got Chris Squire playing piano, and he convinced Trevor Horn, who is a bass player, to play bass on this track. And Horn had said, and I quote, "I didn't quite know what to play on it. One day we spent 12 hours playing and working on the final bass part." So it took 12 hours of him and Squire working together for him to get the bass part to Run Through the Light. Does It Really Happen is another great tune. But I think my favourite on this album is Into the Lens. Now, this is a bit of a story. It's a song written by Horn and Downes and later released on their Buggles album, Adventures in Modern Recording. It's on that album, it's called I Am a Camera. And I think they came to Yes with the essentials of the song and with the input from Howe, Squire and White. it became an 8.5-minute Yes song with a more progressive rock sound. Into the Lens and the Buggles version, I Am a Camera, actually have slightly different lyrics. Did you know that, Brian?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Because it's one of my favourite songs, and I tend to take close note of, the couple of different versions that are actually out there. So there's just a few little differences in the lyrics. And the single edit of the Yes version, Into the Lens, is actually titled Into the Langs bracket I Am a Camera. So that's pretty nice, isn't it? That's a little bit about the Yes album Drama. I highly recommend it. I say go and have a listen to that if you like the more commercial sound, the more, I don't want to say pop rock. It's not fair to say that, but the more commercial sounding, Yes. And to that end, to be honest with you, the very next album, 90215, is also one of my very favourite albums. I want to talk about that for a minute. Do you like this one too, Brian?
I do. I absolutely love it. But if I might just say, I can't say enough good things about Drama. That album is perfect. And I agree with you. My favorite song is the same as yours on that one. And you've got, it's got an edge to it that most of the other albums don't have. It's like you said, it's a little heavier. It's just got this really great, drive to the whole album, and great, the mix of the riffs and the music with the catchiness. The catchiness isn't over. Yeah, the catchiness isn't over the top. The hooks aren't bubblegum, but they pull you in, man, and that is a great album. Sorry, but 90125 I really like a lot too. But of course, there was a big change that happened there, so if you want to tell us about that, sorry.
Yeah, okay, so 90215, it's the 11th Yes studio album, released in 1983. It's their biggest selling album, containing perhaps their most well-known song by listeners who aren't necessarily Yes fans. So a lot of people would know the song Owner of a Lonely Heart, because it got a lot of airplay. It got a lot of airplay here in Australia. Did it have a lot of airplay in the United States, Brian?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So we won't talk too much about that, but after the Drama album, the Drama tour, Yes disbanded, and a new band was formed called Cinema. Now, this band included Chris Squire, Alan White, another former Yes keyboardist, Tony Kaye, and South African guitarist Trevor Rabin. So they go into the studio and they started recording an album as a band called Cinema. And they also had the former singer from the Drama album, Trevor Horn, as producer. Now, during the mixing stage, former singer John Anderson was invited to take the reins again as lead vocalist. And guess what? Voila! You have the band that was called Cinema release an album 90215, and guess what? They're called Yes again. Now, this is a very short version of how this all came about. There's so many interesting twists and turns, but for the sake of brevity, we might move on and just talk about a couple of tracks. Again, like the previous album that we talked about, it's hard for me to pick a weak track on this album. I can understand why it is their biggest success so far. So I'm recommending it to anyone and everyone. But let me give some attention to one particular track here beside Owner of a Lonely Heart. Besides that tune, which did hit number 1, by the way. But besides that one, there were 3 other singles released from this album. And I want to talk about one of these, and it's called It Can Happen. Do you like this one, Brian? It Can Happen?
I do, yes. There's not a bad song on that album either, but yeah.
It's great, isn't it? I love albums like this. It reminds me of Boston's first album. There's not a bad song on the whole album. It's just brilliant. But It Can Happen. So the band that was originally going to be called Cinema, they had recorded their version of It Can Happen with Chris Squire on vocals, and it's actually very well done because, as you said, Brian, Chris had a great voice, and you can hear him in a lot of Yes songs. When you hear him lead sing, you realise, okay, that's him in the backup vocals. That's him, almost co-singing on a lot of songs, co-lead vocals. There's so many Yes songs you go, oh, wow, that's him. He's a really good voice. But anyway, they had their version of it recorded, and when Anderson was invited to rejoin them and record this album with them, he brought some of his own touches to the song, and on the Yes version, he's actually included in the writing credits. The album version is always going to be the better version for prog rock fans because it's a little bit longer. But the single version reached number 5 on the charts, and you can go onto YouTube and see the couple of videos that are up there. You can also hear at least 3 different versions of the song. You've got the cinema version, you've got the Yes album version, and you've got the Yes single version. Now, the Yes single version misses out on some of the dialogue that can be heard under the guitar solo. And I'm going to read those lines for you. So under the guitar solo, it says, "Come, old boy, you had much better have the thing out at once." And that is exactly what dentists always do. Now, go on. Tell me the whole thing. Now, that's from Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest. Did you know that, Brian?
No, I did not.
It always stood out to me from the first time I heard that song, and every time I hear this song, I always hear that under there, and I knew it had some significance, historical literature significance, so I had to look it up, but it is from Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest. Isn't that something? A couple of more points of interest before I hand you back to Brian here. Yes toured Argentina after the release of 90215, and I think they had a couple of dates in Buenos Aires, and it was the first time that an English band had performed in the country following the Falklands War, which, as you will all know, was fought between the Brits and the Argentinians following Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands. And while I'm here, I just want to give a big shout out to all the British forces down there in Stanley. G'day, and stay warm down there, fellas. Anderson stated that the group actually had to be escorted into the country in a private Air Force jet and was surrounded by military during the entire visit. They even had a conference call with the president of Argentina before their arrival, who ensured their safety because there had been lots of death threats against them because, you know, they were Brits and they were coming to tour as the first Brit band after the invasion of the Falklands and the Falklands War. Now, isn't that something?
Yeah.
Now, the album almost got called something else. It was almost called the New Yes album, but they decided to go with its allocated catalogue number, which was actually, wait for it, do you know what it was, Brian?
No.
90214. But sleeve designer Gary Mewett said, and I quote, "Because they couldn't get consistency worldwide with that number, it got changed to 90125.
No, that's it.
90125, right. 90125. And he said, I've still got some rough tour T-shirts and sleeves with the original number on it. That's amazing, isn't it? Now, there is actually a Yes-related album out there called 90214, and that's Trevor Rabin's album of demo tracks called 90214, and that was released in 2003. So I reckon that was quite good, cool, groovy, cute. Call it whatever you want that he called it that, you know. I mean, I would have done it too. Now, I warned you that this is be very subjective. I keep saying that, and, you know, I'm getting very excited here as I'm talking about these couple of brilliant albums, but I might even go as far as saying that, you know, it could be, I'm not sure, it might be, but maybe my favourite Yes song, which is Hold On, is on this album. So do yourself a favour. Go and have a listen to that song. If you can't listen to the whole album, go and listen to the song Hold On. Okay, so that's 90215. Brian.
Before we wind up our part one here, I was just going to throw in a couple of little
tidbits,
anecdotes, or tidbits. Thank you. So it may be interesting to note. First of all, I'd like to say that Trevor Rabin, for those who are like you and I, who like to dig and find back catalog of what these people were doing solo and prior to their involvement with Yes or even after. Trevor, I always say Trevor Rabin, but I guess it's Rabin. I've heard several people say Rabin. So, he had been in a South African band called Rabbit, Rabbitt, maybe. I'm not sure if it's spelled exactly the same as the Aussie band, because there was an Aussie band called Rabbit that was quite different. But
I did not know that.
yes, and I had found they had at least, I think he had at least 2 or 3 maybe albums with them, but honestly, I wasn't really impressed with it. That's not to talk negative about him or the band. It just wasn't really my cup of tea, because I had already been introduced to Rabin through his work with Yes at that point, and it was quite a different animal. So if somebody's interested and they want to find that, and I got to say that his playing, that is, since he was the sole guitar player on 90125, Rabin was, versus having Steve Howe in the band, but his sound really revolutionized things in the music industry and in guitar playing. As soon as I heard him play, or the work he had done on that album, immediately I was like, how's he doing that? How in the world is he getting that sound? So he had brought to the forefront the harmonizer for the guitar, where you can take and you say you play a note and it can play a fifth and an octave of that. Like there's an effects. I'm trying to keep it in layman's terms here for people who may not be musicians, but the sound that he was using technology and the gear at the time that was becoming popular, and he was bringing it to the forefront. So these things called harmonizers for the guitar, or octavers. And he was getting these really big guitar sounds, especially with his leads and melody lines and things like that. It was really cool. To me, it was really cool sound, and it was very, something that I hadn't heard of before, because normally, in the past, if you wanted to get, multiple tones while you're playing, you'd do one track. Say you do your one track with the one note, then you'd double that track with the fifth of that note, or the seventh, or the octave, or whatever you're playing on the guitar. Well, he was incorporating these basically computerized things that actually did all that work for you. You could do all those notes at once. So that being said, he just brought this whole other element, and not only just his playing and his tones and sound, but his production values, the way that the music was recorded and produced was at a whole new level with 90125 and following. And they also were leading the rest of the music industry into this new age of,
I saw what you did
there. He was leading, the music. They were leading the music industry into this whole new age of how to approach recording and producing music. I don't want to leave out another side note that I have here, even though we haven't talked much about Anderson, like personally, him.
No, not
personally
in depth.
Focused on him. Yeah, but he had a friendship with, this is just like a little side note about the actor Sherman Hemsley, which people might remember from The Jeffersons, the TV show The Jeffersons. Well, Hemsley was apparently a huge prog rock fan, which I guess that's not, there's nothing strange about that, except for when you consider him playing George Jefferson in The Jeffersons, just the attitude that character, not the actor, but the attitude that the character had on the show. You would never have maybe, coined or thought of him as a progressive rock fan, but he actually did record an album with John Anderson, and it was never released. And it was called Festival of Dreams. And, because Hemsley was a keyboard player, I believe, and he did record some music. He did a couple of singles, I think, and, they're out there. They were released, but apparently Hemsley was like really big into psychedelic. We're going to talk a little bit about this later, but he was into like new age philosophies and psychedelic drugs, psychedelic music. And there's even one episode of The Jeffersons where the son in the show, Lionel, is listening to a radio in the apartment that they lived in, and he's actually listening to the band Nectar, which is a progressive rock band from the, spanning the same time period that Yes has as well. And George Jefferson, the character played by Hemsley, he comes in and while Lionel's listening to it, and he starts dancing around, and it's like he was such a huge fan of Yes and prog rock that he not only recorded, an album with John Anderson, but, they incorporated it into one of the episodes of the Jeffersons, which I'm sure was probably his doing. Yeah, you can find the clip on YouTube of that song, him coming and playing that. But, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw those in before, cause I know that in our next segment, we're gonna focus more on the philosophies behind the music of Yes and the members of Yes.
Yeah.
And, just wanted to throw those little tidbits in because they're not going to fit in later on. So.
No, that's cool. All right. Okay. All right. Well, we will leave it there. And we will come back and, we'll do a part 2 of Yes. We'll talk a bit more about, some, music, but we'll definitely get into the, philosophy side of things when we do that, and underneath the music and, from the members of the band, and lots more. So stay tuned. Come back very soon for part 2 of Philosopher Rock and Yes. So we'll leave it there for now. Brian, thanks for your time, mate, and we'll have to hit record on part 2 very soon.
Yes, sounds good. Thank you for doing this with me. It's kind of cathartic for us to both just kind of like get all this out, as far as our love for Yes, and I appreciate your willingness to do this, and I appreciate your input because you've enlightened me on a few things today, as is par for the course. So that's good.
Yeah, well, you have too. You've given me a couple of tidbits there that I didn't know as well. Very interesting, and I'm going to go and look some of them up because I, pride myself on knowing as much as I can about Yes. But anyway, all right. So until next time, I'll just say God bless and hooroo.
Happy trails.